The mahogany door to Richard Harrington's corner office swung open with such force that his assistant flinched. The billionaire CEO stormed past her without a word, his face twisted in disgust. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled pawn shop receipt, and his knuckles had gone white from gripping it so hard. Outside, rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrington Tower, but the storm brewing inside was far more violent. Richard had just discovered something that made his blood boil. The janitor, the man he'd shown unprecedented kindness by hiring despite his checkered past, had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way possible. Marcus Webb had worked the night shift at Harrington Tower for 8 months. At 53, with graying temples and hands calloused from decades of hard labor, he was the kind of man who blended into the background. He arrived at 9 each evening, pushing his yellow cleaning cart through the gleaming corridors of power where deals worth millions were struck daily. The executives barely noticed him. Richard Harrington was different, though. He'd personally approved Marcus's hiring after learning the man had spent 5 years in prison for a crime he'd committed in desperate circumstances, stealing medication for his dying wife. Everyone deserves a second chance, Richard had told his HR director, overriding her concerns. It was a motto he lived by, one he'd inherited from his own father who'd built the Harrington empire from nothing. Richard prided himself on being a CEO with a conscience, a billionaire who remembered where he came from. But now, staring at that receipt, Richard felt like a fool. The violin had been a family heirloom, a 1742 Guarneri del Gesù worth over $3 million. It had belonged to Richard's great-grandfather, an Italian immigrant who'd played in the streets of New York to feed his family. Richard kept it displayed in a climate-controlled case in the building's executive lounge, a symbol of his family's journey from poverty to prosperity. And somehow, it had ended up in a dingy pawn shop downtown, sold by Marcus Webb for $15,000. Security footage told the story. Marcus, working alone on the graveyard shift, had disabled the case's alarm. Clearly planned, Richard thought bitterly, and carefully removed the violin. The betrayal cut deeper than the monetary loss. Richard had trusted this man. He'd given him a chance when no one else would. "Get him up here," Richard barked into his phone. Now, 20 minutes later, Marcus stood in the office, rain dripping from his worn jacket onto the Persian rug. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "I can explain," Marcus started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Explain." Richard's voice could have cut glass. "You stole from me. After everything I did for you. After I stood up for you, fought to give you this job, believed in you when no one else would. And this is how you repay me. By pawning my family's most precious possession for what? Drug money? Gambling debts? No, sir, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." Richard stood, placing both palms on his desk, leaning forward. "I'm calling the police. You're going back to prison, Marcus. And this time, you'll have no one to blame but yourself." Marcus's face crumpled. "Please, just let me tell you why." "I don't care why." But even as Richard said it, something in Marcus's expression gave him pause. It wasn't the look of a guilty man making excuses. It was something else. Anguish. Desperation. The same look Richard had seen in the mirror 20 years ago when his own daughter, Lily, had been diagnosed with leukemia. Against his better judgment, Richard sat back down. "You have 2 minutes." Marcus took a shaky breath. "My daughter, Emma. She's 16. 3 months ago, she was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, bone cancer. Aggressive. The kind that doesn't wait." His voice cracked. "My insurance from here, it covers a lot, but not the experimental treatment she needs. The one that might actually save her life. It costs $18,000. Money I don't have. Money I could never have." Richard's jaw tightened. "So you stole from me." "I pawned the violin, yes. I knew it was wrong. I knew I'd lose everything. My job, my freedom, maybe. But I also knew that without that treatment, I'd lose Emma." Tears streamed down Marcus's weathered face. "She's all I have left in this world, Mr. Harrington. My wife is gone. Emma is my everything. What would you have done if it was your daughter?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard thought of Lily, now 28 and healthy, working as a music teacher in Brooklyn. He remembered those dark days when she'd been sick, how he would have burned down the world to save her. How he'd have sold everything, sacrificed anything. But he'd been rich. He'd had options. Marcus had nothing. I'm sorry, Marcus whispered. I'll go to prison. I deserve it. But please, please, don't make the pawn shop give back the money before Emma gets her treatment. It's already paid for. She starts tomorrow. Please. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. He looked at this broken man standing before him, seeing not a thief but a father willing to sacrifice his freedom for his child's life. Isn't that exactly what Richard would have done? Get out, Richard said quietly. Marcus nodded, shoulders sagging in defeat as he turned toward the door. Wait, Richard stood. What pawn shop? Marcus's brow furrowed in confusion. Eddie's, on 5th and Main. Why? Richard grabbed his coat. Because we're going to get that violin back. And then you're going to tell me everything about Emma's treatment. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time Richard's Mercedes pulled up to Eddie's pawn shop. The violin was still there, displayed prominently in the window. Richard paid $30,000 to retrieve it, double what Marcus had received. Eddie didn't ask questions when a billionaire walked through his door. In the car, Marcus stared at the violin case resting between them. I don't understand. Emma, Richard said. Tell me about her. She's brilliant. Before she got sick, she was first chair violin in her school orchestra. She dreams of Juilliard. Marcus's voice softened with love. She plays beautifully. Even now, weak from chemo, she practices every day she can. Says music is the only thing that makes her forget the pain. Something clicked in Richard's mind. A memory of his own daughter, finding solace in music during her darkest days. When they arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, Emma was in her room, pale and thin, an IV attached to her arm. But when she saw her father, her face lit up with a smile that could power cities. Dad, did they approve the treatment? It's handled, sweetheart, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Emma's eyes drifted to Richard standing in the doorway. Who's this? Richard stepped forward, carrying the violin case. I'm a friend of your father's. He tells me you play. Emma's eyes widened when she saw the case. Even weakened by illness, she recognized quality craftsmanship. As that, it's a Guarneri del Gesù, Richard said softly, opening the case. It belonged to my great-grandfather. I want you to play it. With trembling hands, Emma lifted the violin. The moment the bow touched the strings, magic happened. Despite her illness, despite everything, she played with a passion and skill that stole Richard's breath. She played Vivaldi's Winter, and in that sterile hospital room, Richard heard his great-grandfather's spirit singing through the centuries. When the last note faded, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Beautiful, Richard whispered. Emma, how would you like to keep this violin? What? Marcus and Emma spoke simultaneously. It was meant to be played, not displayed in a case. My great-grandfather would have wanted it in the hands of someone who could make it sing like that. Richard smiled. Consider it a scholarship. For Juilliard, when you get there. And you will get there, Emma. Sir, I can't possibly, Marcus began. You can, and you will. You did something terrible for the right reasons. You remind me that sometimes the measure of a person isn't in their worst moments, but in why they made those choices. You remind me of what my father used to say, everyone deserves a second chance. Richard placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. But next time you need help, ask. That's what second chances are for. 3 years later, Richard sat in the audience at Juilliard's annual spring concert. On stage, radiant and healthy, Emma Webb stood as featured soloist. In her hands, the Guarneri sang its story, a tale of redemption, sacrifice, and the unexpected kindness that can bloom even in the coldest hearts. Marcus sat beside Richard, both men wiping tears as Emma played. Sometimes the most valuable things we own aren't meant to be kept locked away. Sometimes they're meant to be given away, to find their way into hands that will let them sing again. And sometimes, the people we judge most harshly are the ones who teach us the greatest lessons about love.